thank you very much for this invitation. I'm going to talk about the implications of the companion volume for assessment. And that's a plan of the presentation. We'll start off just talking about the status of the CV, and then descriptors, and then move into assessment and the core messages that the document has for classroom assessment and challenges in relation to more formal assessment. And the discussion, this is supposed to be an interactive session, although I don't think we have very many people. So the idea is that the discussions part would be on the challenges for formal assessment. So in terms of the status of the companion volume, the important point is that it is a replacement for the 2001 CEFR as a point of entry. It's not a guide. So the intention is that for the vast majority of users, they would enter the concept of the CEFR through the CV. And what it says, in the foreword, it says that with this new and more user-friendly version, it's an attempt to respond to the many comments that the 2001 edition was very a complex document that many language professionals found difficult to access, whereas the CV basically summarizes the conceptual parts of the CEFR in a short illustrated text of about 25 pages, and then gives you all of the descriptors in one place with rationales explaining what each scale is about. And then, of course, you've got the updated and extended version of all of the CEFR descriptors, which replaces the 2001 edition. In terms of the descriptors, I guess that most people are familiar that the A and C levels are beefed up. Pre-A1 has been introduced, the plus levels are filled out. Listening and reading is greatly improved. Phonology, there's a new scale that replaces the old one and focuses more on, it's an analytic scale with one subscale on sound articulation, and the other on prosody, that's to say stress and intonation. Then there are scales for online interaction, and the bulk of the new scales, as you can see, are for mediation, with also 3 new scales for plurilingual, pluricultural. I guess most people by now are familiar with all of the different mediation scales, so I'm not going to go into that in any detail. But a point that needs to be made is that some descriptor scales are, well, I mean, there are two. The idea of having so many descriptor scales is that you choose what is relevant for any particular situation. Some of these descriptor scales are only appropriate for languages for specific purposes, or just perhaps the word only is a little bit too strong. I mean, we can probably all think of situations in which ordinary people need to attend a formal meeting, or even addressing audiences. I mean, you may have to make a little speech at a wedding or a baptism or something. And I guess we could rack our brains to think of a situation in which one might make a public announcement, like saying the barbecue is open. And in terms of the 2020 scales, managing interaction is clearly talking about what teachers do, or coaches, or animateurs. And facilitating communication in delicate situations is more talking about the type of thing which what in French are called mediateurs do. It's cultural or relational mediation of trying to prevent problems. It's a sort of thing teachers do in the school playground and classroom a lot of the time. And finally, amplifying a dense text when you have a text which is again, it's something that is part of teaching, that you explain concepts which are presented in a way that is so dense that people can't understand them. And this message about selective use of the descriptors is emphasized by 2 needs profiles which are presented in the companion volume. This one is for a B1 class, the class in secondary school, and the point is that not all of the descriptors are there. There's only about, I don't know, 30 descriptor scales there out of something like as many as 80, and you don't have to be the same level in everything, and some things are more important in any needs profile. So you need to do some things more than other things. This is the point, that you don't need to be the same level in everything. Moving on, what is the view on assessment? Well, the concept of assessment for learning, assessment as learning, and in a moment, assessment of learning, comes from the assessment reform group towards the end of the 1990s, and the CFR take on assessment is very much in alignment with the ARG, where the concept is that assessment should be integrated with planning and implementation or enacting, because the evaluation should feed back into the teaching and learning. And the planning, I mean, the curriculum doesn't exist until it has been enacted, and the whole thing is a dynamic, iterative process. That's not to say that the CFR does not consider assessment of learning seriously. It's in fact on the CFR website there are a wealth of resources to help people to align their tests to the CFR. And I'm just showing you there under the tab tests and examinations, there are a lot of resources which are very helpful for that purpose. But the focus on the CFR CV is to try and put the focus back on more on teaching and learning. And so I'm going to just go into that a little bit. I mean, one of the points that is often made is that the CFR is more than just descriptors. In 2007, Cost used the analogy, or well, the metonymy. He talked about the metonymy of talking about the CFR as if it was just descriptors. That's a metonymy is like when you say, a sail, when you mean a ship. It's using a part of something to describe the whole. Graves, we just looked at this concept of a dynamic, systemic, integrated curriculum with constructive alignment. And then a couple of points made by Picardo. First of all, that mediation, rather than being something just separate and stuck on, is central to the CFR vision of the social agent completing a complex task. That's to say that during the process of completing a complex task, you mobilize all of your competences, both linguistic competences and general competences like intercultural competence, emotional competence, etc., whatever, existential competence, savoir-être. And then finally, that plurilingualism offers the opportunity to rethink the whole approach to language teaching and learning. The main point, the most important point from a language assessment viewpoint is the fact that it's an integrative concept, that communication is an integral part of tasks where participants engage in interaction, production, reception, and mediation, or a combination of these. And so mediation is not just a fifth skill to add on, I mean, which some people interpret it as. The whole idea is that effective learning, or which of these theories that have developed in the last 30 years, but have become better known in applied linguistics in relation to language learning in the last 20 years, is connected with complexity theory, where the first serious book on this subject was in language learning with Lars von Friedem in '97, which is simultaneous with the production of the CFR. And the concept of the action-oriented approach is very linked to Van Leer's concept. It is the same as Van Leer's concept of action-based teaching, which is an operationalization of an ecological approach to language learning, which is closely related to the concept of complexity. That you move from a linear view of I teach this, they learn it, we test it, to a more complex view of what is actually happening in the classroom. This is closely related to the development of socio-constructive and socio-cultural theories based on the work of Vygotsky, which leads to concepts like Lavenwenger's community of practice, the idea that you learn just as much from other people in your group as you will learn from the teacher or trainer. So collaborative learning has become more and more important in all education. And as a way of also the whole concept of agency, of intentionality, of planning, monitoring what you're doing, reflection, leading to self-efficacy, which is the belief that you can be successful. And that, of course, more than one language is always present in whatever you're doing. Even if you think you only have English in your classroom, in fact, everybody has their mother tongue in their heads. So in an action-oriented approach, learners are seen as social agents. Social agents exert their agency within a particular context, which gives conditions and constraints. And this is very much related to Halliday's concept of the meaning potential. What you can mean in any situation is to some extent determined by that range of options and affordances available in that situation. And then the agentive part is that you mobilize all of your resources and develop strategies in iterative cycles in order to plan, produce results, and monitor those results. And the bit that's rather difficult from a language testing point of view is the social context. It's very difficult to have a genuine social context. The idea of learners mobilizing all of their resources, when very often in a language test, what you're trying to do historically, traditionally, is to isolate a particular thing and test it rather than to do a holistic assessment. And the idea of iterative cycles in order to plan, produce results, and monitor action. It's far easier to see that happening in a classroom than it is to see it happening in a formal context. So what is action orientation all about? It's about using one or more languages to complete an integrated task in which you make sense of something, collaborate to produce something, to create artifacts, using local or authentic materials as sources creatively, and the teachers thinking in terms of levels. What can I expect from at a B1 that I can't expect at A2, etc. So purposeful collaborative tasks should include things like allowing initiative, so people can exert their agency, involve the students selecting or researching source materials in relation to a defined mission to produce something, and it requires co-construction between the team through mediation of concepts, etc., and set some kind of conditions and constraints. So the core messages are integration of skills, agency, mediation of texts and concepts, collaborative co-construction, and the recognition of the fact you have different languages. And in practice in the classroom, this action-oriented approach boils down to task projects leading to doing something, integration of skills in different phases of activity, agency in terms of planning, decision-making, and monitoring, mediation of texts from sources, and then mediating the concepts in the group, developing the concepts together in collaborative co-construction of meaning. And in relation to those different phases, in relation to the sources, into relation to the, finding the sources, understanding the reception, understanding the materials, interacting together in the group, and the product. What is the language policy? Do you use this language A for the sources, and language A for the interaction, language B for the product? You need to define what it is that they're supposed to do, especially even in a classroom. And the descriptors can help to develop the tasks, and it can help to monitor the activity. And this is a bit of a leap forward in terms of day-to-day classroom practice, but it's not technically difficult. Whereas these same issues in relation to formal assessment do present challenges. The scenario or the context for the task. This is the part that people who have tried implementing mediation in assessment in Greece and in Germany have found most difficult. And they found, frankly, in my opinion, they've done it a bit better in Greece generally. This is the work of Bessie Dendrinos and her student, Maria Stafanopoulou. And then integration of skills. You may remember that there was a wave of integrated skills at the end of the 80s, early 90s. And the difficulty with integrated skills is how to score the different sections from the text, because everything is dependent on everything else. So it's a little difficult. Agency. How much is it feasible to give students agency in a test environment when the whole point is that you're trying to standardize everything and restrict to one variable? Mediation of text and concepts. Should this actually be assessed in itself, or should one consider that mediation of in the group, etc., leads to a better product, and then you assess the output, assess the quality of the output. There was a very good article in the new CFR journal, in I think the first issue, on this topic from two researchers from St. Petersburg, who concluded that it's better that the training the students in mediation using the mediation descriptors leads to a better language output. Assessed in traditional terms of, fluency, accuracy, interaction, etc. Collaboration collaborative co-construction. Well, there are some articles about the issues involved in having pairs for an oral assessment. What about if you have a group of 4? What's going on in that group? What are the group dynamics? How do you deal with somebody dominating it? And then finally, language policy. If there's more than one language present, when do you handle the issue that there are different languages? Do you accept this? Do you insist on a one language policy, etc.? And then in terms of criteria, how useful are the descriptors? So it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And one example of a very interesting implementation is the Austrian professional Matura, in which students have to show B2 competence in their L2, which is usually English, or German if they're an immigrant, and B1 competence in their second foreign language, which can be is usually French, but can also be other languages like Spanish or Russian. And they have to demonstrate an ability to switch between languages, pluricultural competence, and communication strategies. In the first phase, which is mediating text, they present information which the information is in L1, and they present it to speakers of their L2, who are their teachers, and they have to present it in each of the 2 languages. So they would be presenting material which is in German, and they would be presenting it in English and in French to somebody else, and they have to alternate between these 2 languages, probably English and French, while they're making this presentation, because they have to talk to 2 different people who pretend they don't speak the other language. And then in phase 2, they collaborate with the L2 and L3 speaker in order to design a joint project, which could be designing an exhibition together, or setting up a project with partner schools in different countries. And in this process, they act as an intermediary between the other 2 who cannot speak each other's languages, so they have to act as an informal interpreter, and they also have to mediate concepts to facilitate the way the discussion moves forward, help to clarify concepts, etc., etc. So it can be done, but it's challenging, and that is what I thought that we might discuss. Thank you. I'll leave this up rather than closing it, if that's technically okay, because then people can see what it is that we're supposed to discuss.